there. So, like you said, I'm LisaBacker, and this is the obligatory picture of my family. This was taken pretty recently at a Nationals game, and I'm not a huge baseball fan, but this whole World Series thing made it appropriate. So my husband, my 2 kids, and then my in-laws in the background. So like I said, my title is Senior Software Engineer, but it wasn't always. I started out with no CS degree and kind of an organic career path. I started out wanting to work in the arts, in dance programming, which is not the same as computer programming. So I spent the first 9 years of my career here at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in DC. I eventually ended up working in the office of the CIO because I wanted to stay there so badly, and they had web folks reporting. So I started helping out. I don't know how much you know about the arts, but it doesn't pay all that well, so I also waited tables at a crab restaurant. And seasonal crabs in the East Coast are only a summertime thing, so in the winter it was pretty slow. So I spent my time reading manuals, because software came with manuals back then. So these manuals gave me like a good idea of the tools in my toolbox, a little bit of what was available in a language, but not really the best way to use things. So I kept reading the manuals, and I kept getting better, and I started getting promoted, and a couple things happened. I quit waiting tables, and I also started getting a lot more complicated projects to work on. But I didn't have a lot of guidance on how to deal with that. So lucky for me, it was the early 2000s, and a lot of good programming books had just been published. So these books kind of became my mentors. They were more philosophical, and they approached software development as a craft. They validated my approach, and they also supported me with, by helping me understand how to communicate and how to approach new problems and structure my thinking around new problems. So fast forward to today, I work at Dockyard. We are a digital product consulting company, and I get to work with some really, really smart people and some really top-notch clients. Some of my coworkers have CS degrees and some of them don't. They all bring a really unique perspective, and they all approach their work as working on refining their craft. So that reminded me to go back and look at my books. This time, I had a way new level of inspiration from them. It validated my approach still, but it also reminded me why I stick to that approach. And it reminded me that it's worth fighting for doing things the right way, especially when I'm dealing with some challenging projects or challenging people, perhaps. It's given me the inspiration to stay motivated and to keep reinventing myself in tech, because that is a requirement here. So without further ado, the Programmer's Bookshelf. This is how it's going to work. I'm going to cover 3 classics. These are ones I picked based on the impact on my career and based on how they're still relevant today. The first one will be the Pragmatic Programmer, which is my favorite. It really talks about software as a craft. Refactoring, which is kind of more focused advice. And then the Cathedral the Bazaar, which has some great advice about working with teams, and especially as an open source maintainer. And just a little bit of context here. These books were written when enterprise software was very large and complicated and expensive. Everyone had Gantt charts. Everything was waterfall. Open source was new and mistrusted. The Agile Manifesto wasn't written yet, but its methods were certainly starting to come around. Fast forward to now, actually these books are getting revised and republished. And I think that's really given us, it's a testament to how well that advice has held up. Martin Fowler actually says in the preface to the revision of Refactoring that he wonders if there's still a place for books in software development. And he basically decides that it's really a good spot for putting together a large body of knowledge in a cohesive way. So you can always have a web presence of this knowledge, but the packaging matters. So to start off, Pragmatic Programmer, like I said, written in 2000, revised this year, by Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas, who were contributing authors to the Agile Manifesto. It's set up as 70 different tips that are in broad topics, organized into sections. And each section is very short and digestible and cross-referenced to the other sections. And they all have challenge questions at the end that you can work through. The idea of pragmatic, it means to keep a larger perspective, to solve an immediate problem while still thinking about it in context. So this book really was kind of the mentor to me, like I said, in terms of keeping my code elegant and maintainable, but also focusing on deliverability. So I'm going to just present a few highlights from the first 2 sections, which are a pragmatic philosophy and a pragmatic approach. So one of the overarching principles in this book is about personal responsibility, that you're responsible for your career, your deadlines that you set, the code that you write, any problems that come up. You're responsible to raise your hand if something is no longer possible and suggest an alternative. You can't be defeatist about something. You have to say, you know, make suggestions. Perhaps it's refactoring, perhaps it's some more prototyping. But the point is that this isn't going to fly. The section on software entropy is one that I really like. Entropy is the amount of disorder in a system. And in terms of software, it really means like software rot or tech debt or pain, really. So the broken windows idea is that if one broken window in a building leads to a sense of abandonment, and over time you'll get another broken window or graffiti or litter, and eventually the building it just can't be maintained anymore and really does become abandoned. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the lesson here is not to live with broken windows, but to fix each broken window as you come to it. Fix those problems in the code, or board up the window with a comment and an issue in your backlog to come back and deal with it when you have time. But bad decisions, even if they aren't bad at the time, they lead to more and more ill-fitting solutions to work around them. The flip side of this is code that is so pristine that it inspires you to be a better developer. There's a story in the book about one of the author's friends who had a really fancy house and a lot of really nice artwork, and he had a tapestry hanging by the fire. And of course, the tapestry got a little too close and a fire started, and the fire department came. And before they went in to actually battle the fire, they laid out a mat from the front door to the fire because they didn't want to mess up the carpet. It's kind of extreme, but in terms of software, it makes a lot of sense. Like on one hand, you have code that's sloppy, you add to it, you think, well, who cares? It's, you know, it's all lousy anyway. And that leads bad code and also makes you an unhappy, unmotivated developer. Or you have code that is so beautiful and so well tested that even if you have the fire of a raging deadline approaching, you just don't want to be the first one to make a mess. Another lesson, have you ever used an app where there's just, they didn't know where to stop? There's a checkbox or a toggle or something for every possible configuration option. The concept of knowing when to stop is really tricky in both design and in code. It's really easy to get bogged down in details of requirements or to try and figure out every possible imaginable future possibility. The idea in the book here is really to focus more on writing great software today rather than trying to make the perfect software of tomorrow. And then knowledge and experience as developers, they're our most valuable assets, but they do expire as technology moves on quickly. So the Pragmatic Programmer tells us to treat our experience as an investment portfolio and offers advice like invest in yourself as a regular habit. So small things like podcasts or blogs or going to meetups or speaking at meetups. Diversify. So they set a goal of learning a new language every year, and I really wish I had kept up with that, but I think we could also include frameworks these days. Balancing your portfolio. So don't put all your technical eggs in one basket, right? It's fun to play with the new shiny every time it comes out, but also keep up with the core underlying work. Maximize your return. Maximize your return. So it was all that time spent with the new shiny thing can also pay off, though, if that happens to be the winner of a tech war. So just keep exploring. And then finally, rebalance your portfolio. Don't just sit on your laurels. Like, keep an eye on where you want your career to go and what technology you really enjoy working with. So to move into the more pragmatic approach section, dry, don't repeat yourself. So this was coined in the Pragmatic Programmer by Dave Thomas. It's a really simple concept. It seems really obvious and really easy, but it's overused and misunderstood, and people still argue about it regularly, particularly at my company for some reason. And the key point that I think people need to pay attention to is that it is about a single piece of knowledge not being duplicated. It's not about 3 or 4 lines of code. I think that would help guide folks. So in the book, it goes through this, but also as well as more in-depth into different types of duplication and possible solutions for those types of duplication. There's a section on reversibility that reminds us that there is always more than one way to implement anything. And there are strategies to help us deal with our decisions in the future. So guarding us against changing our minds, either architecturally or otherwise. The thing I've enjoyed about this section is in one of the challenge questions, it asks us to talk about, to think about Schrodinger's cat. So, assuming catch everyone up to speed, Schrodinger's cat, there's a cat in a box. It has a 50% chance that it's alive and a 50% chance that it's dead. The box is closed. Until you open that box, there are two alternate universes presented, one where it's equally alive or equally dead. So therefore, it could be both until you open the box. That's when you find out which universe you're actually in. So no wonder it's really hard to code for the future, because how many alternative universes have you created with the choices you've made in your code and your architecture? And are you ready to support it once you open that box and find out which universe you're really living in? So raise your hand if you've heard of rubber ducking. Yay, all right. So rubber ducking, this whole concept of just explaining something very simply, this also comes from a story in the Pragmatic Programmer. So there's a lot of great things in here, and I don't have time to go over anywhere near all of them, even from the first two sections, because we have to move on. So refactoring, this was written in 1999, also came out this year, revised this year, by Martin Fowler and Kent Beck. They are two giants in programming, and if you're not familiar with them, please go look them up. I will point out that from the first edition of this book, all the examples were in Java. Now they're all in JavaScript. So refactoring is the process of changing a software system in a way that you don't alter the external behavior, but just change the internal processes. It's improving the design of the code after you've written it. And this process for getting a bar of soap has probably gone through a few refactorings, perhaps needs a few more. So the way the book is set up, there's a whole chapter that starts as an example, and it's a billing system for theatrical troops. So it's a little more than a to-do application and a little less than the real world. But in the chapter, it goes through and walks through the steps of making small improvements and adding a few features and fixing a few bugs. And then after that, there's a chapter on the principles of refactoring, one on code smells, one on tests, and then the bulk of it is really a pattern library. So what you get from the example chapter really is the focus that you always need a solid test suite before you start. That is your guide throughout. And then you make a really small change, run your tests, commit your code. It's a very short feedback cycle. Your code should always be in a working state. You should always be able to revert small changes. You repeat. So refactoring is often done for readability. The code archaeology is kind of the concept of going through and trying to understand what the code's doing. And after you gain all that insight, refactoring is when you take that insight from your head and put it back into the code. Some say this emphasis on readability can hamper performance, but the argument in the book is really that it's hard to performance tune poorly written code. You're always better off after you refactor anyway. So why would you refactor? To fix those broken windows, right? To eliminate duplicated code. Readability, like I said, one of the things that I like is after I fix a problem is to take a step back before I commit it and to really think about the readability and give it another pass. That saves that poor soul in the future who has to read that code again, and that's usually me. Fowler says he puts everything into the code so that he doesn't have to remember it. We refactor to find bugs. So a part of this is that when you clarify the intent of the code, it makes it a lot easier to see when things don't line up properly. Kent Beck said, "I'm not really a great programmer, I'm just a good programmer with great habits." And then the primary reason is speed. Doing that code archaeology step, that really slows everything down. And it slows down adding new features, as does working around older patterns. Once you've finished refactoring, you can add those features a lot faster. So a technically savvy manager would encourage refactoring because they know it's continuous code improvement. But some managers think refactoring is just fixing bad code, and they don't have time for that. So what do you do if that's your manager? Martin Fowler actually has advice in the book for this, and he says to just do it anyway and don't tell them. He basically says that this kind of manager, any manager really, is very schedule-driven. And what they want is their change fast. And if you know that the fastest way to get there is to make a small change that's going to improve the code, then that's the right way to go. It's your responsibility to your team and your future self to make those changes and speed everyone up as you go. Now, there are times when not to refactor. It's very subjective. So there are a few that are listed specifically in the book. One is when you're dealing with code that is you only use rather than modify, almost like a kind of messy internal API. And in that case, they talk about really treating it as you would an external API, just making a little isolated layer to deal with it, and not going any further, that it's probably not worth your effort. Similarly, code that you don't use a lot, again, not going to be worth your effort to go through and spend a lot of time on unless the team is going to gain knowledge from your work. If you have a small feature, but you look at it and say, I want to make this change, and it's going to be this huge deal to go through and make the big refactor, it's probably also not worth it and keeping an eye on deliverability. But the caveat being that if you see this over and over and over, then it's probably time to make the change. And then finally, of course, sometimes you really should rewrite. That is so subjective that Martin Fowler doesn't even, he touches it in the book basically to say it's out of scope of even discussing. Finally, they warn, and I agree with, that refactoring shouldn't be done just in the name of clean code or like good engineering practices. Anything else that sounds very moral, these are not the reasons to refactor. It's not to show how sparkly clean your code can be. It's really purely economic. It's purely about adding new features and fixing bugs quickly. Your tech lead is responsible for guiding the team on when and what to refactor. And because there's so much judgment involved, it's probably a good pairing or mentoring opportunity. So next, they go into code smells, which is a term you've probably heard. So a code smell, like a smell of a diaper, it is a surface indication that usually corresponds to a deeper problem. It's quick to spot. You can sniff it out. It doesn't always mean that there's a problem. But it means you should take a closer look. So in the book, they go through 22 specific possible code smells, everything from duplicated code, large classes, long parameter lists. Each section has an explanation for why it's a smell, what to look for, and some suggested patterns to deal with it. And because they are so easy to spot, Martin Fowler has a section on his website where he suggests having the lead developer on a team pick a code smell of the week and have junior devs go look for that smell and then pairing on solutions, which I thought was a great idea. So, like I said, the bulk of the book is actually a refactoring catalog of patterns. So rather than walk through those, I'm just going to give you the idea of how they're set up. So every pattern has a name, just to give a common vocabulary. Then they have a little summary. It could be a few words, but usually it's more like this, where it's a UML diagram and a couple of lines of code. Then there's the motivation, why you would want to do this, when it should be done, sometimes it shouldn't be done. The mechanics are step-by-step instructions, and I have lousy photography skills, but you might be able to see that it just says, you know, step, step, test, step, step, test. So there's this constant emphasis on super small changes, retesting, and committing. And then there's always an example, which is, you know, kind of a silly textbook-style example. I would suggest when you work on these to go through and kind of read the motivations for each one, and then just file them away as tools in your toolbox and come back for the mechanics later when you want to use it. So finally, towards the end of this book, there's some great advice. And they talk about, like, you're going along, you're refactoring, you're making some changes, everything's good, and then it starts to feel wrong. And you lose your confidence. And it could be that you're just tired. It could be that you realize that, you know, maybe you went down the wrong path and this really wasn't worth it and you just wasted all this time. Their advice at this point is to just stop, take a breath, and, you know, look at what you've done. And if what you have made the code better, that's great. Go ahead and merge it in. If it didn't, or it's got to be thrown out, that's OK. You learned a lesson, and you know the code far more intimately than you would have before. He says it's kind of like walking on a really narrow trail 1,000 feet up. As long as the light and your confidence hold out, then you can keep going. But once that sun goes down, you really should stop for the night. So third book, Cathedral the Bazaar. This was written in 1999 by Eric Raymond, who uses his experience working on fetch mail as what becomes kind of a validation of the countercultural open source movement. So at the time, as I've hinted at, open source wasn't really considered as dependable or viable for the enterprise, and the hackers who did open source were considered very subversive. But like I said, other than just a history lesson, there's a lot of good stuff in here about working with teams. So there's several essays in this book, but I'm just going to go through the first one a little bit. The standard belief at the time was the cathedral, and that was that software needed to be built like cathedrals, carefully crafted by individual wizards or small bands of mages, working in splendid isolation with no beta to be released before its time. So this is the waterfall approach to the extreme. A couple engineers working together to get everything to perfection. Operating systems generally were built this way, sometimes are. And Microsoft was definitely the evil empire in this book, and the author does not hide that, so apologies to anyone who feels otherwise. The Bazaar was conversely considered to be like a great bazaar of different agendas, different approaches, taking submissions from anyone. It's a miracle that anything coherent or stable would come out of this process, and yet Linux did, and Linus Torvald proved that this could work on a large scale. And this is the inspiration for the author. So rather than fall apart in confusion, new improvements could actually come out at a speed that was just not imaginable for open operating systems at the time. So one of the laws that come out of this book, Linus's law, talks about bugs. So in the cathedral approach, bugs are really deep and scary and require months of work by a dedicated few people because you are dealing with releases so far apart. In the Bazaar, you've got possibly thousands of co-developers, the users of your open source project, who can find and report and fix bugs. Just because something might be really difficult or deep for the maintainer, if you have a lot of people out there, it's bound to line up to someone's skill set. And again, a lot of this comes up to your release schedule. So regular releases at the time were still considered a pretty subversive idea. Agile Manifesto wasn't out yet. So we kind of take this for granted, but I bet that some of you at larger companies still struggle with getting regular releases out and keeping trains running on time. Releases are really scary in that point because you don't know when your next one's going to be. So everything has to be perfect. But in the Bazaar approach, bugs get through, and that's OK because they're going to be addressed right away in the next release. Also, from the perspective of the maintainer, this is a great way to reward your contributors. Getting their work out there quickly makes contributors feel wanted and important and energizes them to contribute more to your project. So on the topic of motivation, Raymond's got a lot to say. He talks about egoless programming, which basically says that if developers are not territorial and invite others to look at their code for bugs or improvements, that improvements are made faster. But are open source maintainers really just doing everything out of the goodness of their own heart? There's also a theory that the motivation is really ego satisfaction and boosting your reputation among your peers. And in a lot of areas of volunteering, ego boosting is considered the primary motivation. They both may be kind of partially true, but really I think that there's a third, and this Raymond talks about in the book, that joy is an asset, and many of us really have fun coding. There's kind of an optimal challenge zone that humans really thrive in. It's when you're working on something that's a stretch, but it's still possible. You still get a sense of achievement. And in open source, there's room for everyone to find a task at their level where everyone can achieve that happy programmer feeling. So that happy programmer is neither underutilized nor weighed down with crazy, stressful process friction. So final thought about leadership in open source. So in the cathedral view, you've got a few privileged people, brilliant coders sitting in a room and determine the future, right? They're limited to their own vision, and they're limited to the diversity of the few people sitting in that room. But in the Bazaar view, it's not that brilliance and vision don't matter. It's that leaders can amplify their vision by building a diverse community and spreading through that diverse community. So that's pretty much all the time I have. I should point out that there is sometimes some dated material in these books, specifically when it comes to stereotypes of hacker culture. But the true value is really in principles that translate across languages, but also across time. It's not just about software design, but it's also about principles of people, your career development, motivation, and ethics. So here's a few other books that I think are great. There is a link down here. I'm going to tweet it out later, too. And some of these books are really quite long, but the Agile Manifesto is just a few paragraphs. And perhaps you should read or reread it and see how it motivates you. So thank you very much. I am LisaBacker.